In 1994, an 8-year-old girl vanished without a trace while helping her grandmother at their family-run coffee shop in the quiet town of Millbrook Falls. One moment, Ellie Price was sweeping near the front door, her small brown apron tied carefully around her waist. The next moment, she was gone. No witnesses saw her leave. No signs of struggle marked the scene, just silence where laughter had been only minutes before. For 18 years, her disappearance would haunt the close-knit community, spawning theories that ranged from strangers, passing through to the unthinkable possibility that someone local was hiding in plain sight. But in 2012, during a routine housing inspection at a condemned property just 3 blocks from the coffee shop, contractors would make a discovery that would finally reveal the chilling truth about what happened to Ellie Price and force an entire town to confront the horrifying reality that evil had been sitting among them all along, perhaps even sipping coffee at their counter on the very day she disappeared. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of October 15th, 1994, began like countless others at Millbrook Coffee Company. Margaret Price, known to everyone simply as Grandma Maggie, unlocked the front door at 5:30 sharp, just as she had every morning for the past 12 years. The bell above the entrance chimed its familiar greeting as she stepped into the cozy interior, breathing in the rich aroma of freshly ground beans that seemed to seep from the very walls. Millbrook Falls was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the local coffee shop served as both caffeine dispensary and community center, where children grew up knowing they were safe to walk anywhere in town without fear. Ellie had been spending more time at the shop lately, especially on weekends and school holidays. Her parents, David and Sarah Price, worked demanding schedules at the paper mill that employed nearly half the town, and Grandma Maggie was always happy to have her youngest grandchild's help. At 8 years old, Ellie was already showing signs of the entrepreneurial spirit that ran in the Price family. She would carefully arrange the pastries in the display case, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration as she made sure each item was perfectly positioned. She knew every regular customer by name and their usual orders by heart, charming them with her gap-toothed smile and endless chatter about school projects and playground adventures. That Saturday morning, Ellie had arrived at the shop just after 7, her cheeks still pink from the crisp autumn air. She wore her favorite outfit, a purple sweater with tiny embroidered flowers and dark jeans that were already getting too short for her rapidly growing legs. Over this, she proudly tied the child-sized brown apron that Grandma Maggie had special ordered, just for her, complete with Ellie's assistant embroidered in golden thread across the front. The apron made her feel official, important, like a real member of the coffee shop team, rather than just a child who happened to be there. The morning rush proceeded normally. Jim Henderson, the town's mail carrier, stopped by for his usual large black coffee and blueberry muffin. Mrs. Chen from the flower shop next door picked up her regular chai latte and a bag of ground beans for home. Tom Bradley, who worked the early shift at the hardware store, grabbed his double espresso and exchanged pleasantries about the unseasonably warm weather they'd been having. Each interaction followed the comfortable rhythms of small-town life, predictable and reassuring in their familiarity. Around 9:30, as the morning rush began to wind down, Grandma Maggie asked Ellie to sweep the area near the front entrance, where customers sometimes tracked in leaves and debris. It was a simple task, one that Ellie had performed dozens of times before. She took the small broom from behind the counter, the one that was just the right size for her small hands, and began working her way toward the front of the shop. Grandma Maggie turned her attention to preparing the coffee filters for the next batch of their signature medium roast, a blend that had become famous throughout the county. The last time Margaret Price saw her granddaughter alive, Ellie was humming quietly to herself as she swept, occasionally pausing to look out the large front windows at the maple trees that lined Main Street. Their leaves had turned brilliant shades of red and gold, creating a picture-perfect autumn scene that drew tourists from neighboring towns every weekend. Ellie loved watching people walk by, often waving enthusiastically at anyone who made eye contact through the glass. What happened next remained a mystery that would consume the lives of everyone who loved Ellie Price. When Margaret looked up from her work approximately 10 minutes later, expecting to see her granddaughter still sweeping near the entrance, she found only an empty space where the child had been standing. The small broom lay on the floor near the door, abandoned mid-task. The front door itself remained closed, the bell above it silent. Margaret's first reaction was puzzlement rather than panic. Perhaps Ellie had gone to the restroom or stepped into the small storage area behind the counter to retrieve something. She called out her granddaughter's name, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet shop. No response came. A quick search of the building's interior revealed nothing. The restroom was empty. The storage area contained only supplies and equipment. The back exit, which led to the narrow alley behind the building, was still locked from the inside, exactly as Margaret had left it that morning. It was then that the first tendrils of genuine fear began to wrap themselves around Margaret's heart. She stepped outside, scanning the sidewalks in both directions, looking for any sign of a small girl in a purple sweater and brown apron. Main Street stretched out before her, dotted with the usual Saturday morning shoppers and tourists. But Ellie was nowhere to be seen. Margaret's calls grew more urgent as she began asking passing pedestrians if they had noticed a little girl, if they had seen anything unusual, if they remembered a child walking alone. The responses were uniformly negative. No one had seen Ellie leave the coffee shop. No one remembered noticing a young girl walking by herself. It was as if she had simply evaporated, leaving behind only her abandoned broom and the growing horror of her grandmother's realization that something was terribly, impossibly wrong. Margaret's call to the police came at 9:47 a.m., exactly 17 minutes after she had first noticed Ellie's absence. Her voice, normally steady and confident from years of running a business and raising children, shook as she tried to explain the situation to the dispatcher. Her granddaughter was missing. She had been right there just moments ago, and now she was gone. No, there had been no argument, no reason for the child to run away. No, the door hadn't chimed. No, she hadn't heard anything unusual. The child had simply vanished. Officer Patricia Gonzalez arrived at the coffee shop within 5 minutes of Margaret's call. At 32, Patricia was one of Millbrook Falls' 4 full-time police officers, and she had never dealt with a missing child case. The town's most serious crimes typically involve teenage vandalism, the occasional domestic disturbance, or drunk driving incidents on weekend nights. Missing children were the stuff of urban nightmares, not small-town reality. Patricia's initial assessment of the scene revealed little. The coffee shop showed no signs of struggle or forced entry. The abandoned broom suggested that Ellie had been interrupted in her task, but there were multiple innocent explanations for that. Perhaps she had seen a friend walk by and stepped outside to say hello. Perhaps she had remembered something important and hurried home. Patricia's first instinct was to check the Price family residence, located just 6 blocks away in a tree-lined neighborhood where children regularly walked alone without concern. The call to David and Sarah Price shattered their Saturday morning routine with the devastating force of every parent's worst nightmare. They had assumed Ellie was safely occupied at the coffee shop, learning responsibility and enjoying time with her beloved grandmother. The idea that she could simply disappear from such a familiar, secure environment seemed impossible to comprehend. Within minutes, both parents were racing toward downtown. their minds unable to process the information they had received. By 10:30 that morning, what had begun as a simple missing child report had transformed into a full-scale search operation. Chief of Police Robert Martinez, a 20-year veteran who had moved to Millbrook Falls specifically for its peaceful nature, activated every available resource. Officers began a systematic canvass of the downtown area, questioning every business owner, every customer, every person who might have been in the vicinity of the coffee shop between 9 and 10 o'clock. The search expanded rapidly as volunteers emerged from throughout the community. Teachers from Ellie's elementary school, members of the various churches, customers who knew the Price family from years of morning coffee purchases, all joined the effort to locate the missing child. They combed through the small downtown district, checking every shop, every alley, every possible hiding place where a frightened or confused 8-year-old might have sought refuge. The Millbrook River, which ran along the eastern edge of the town centre, became a particular focus of concern. The autumn rains had raised the water level, and the current ran faster than usual. Search teams walked both banks methodically, looking for any sign that Ellie might have wandered toward the water and encountered trouble. Local fire department volunteers brought their boat, conducting a careful search of the river itself while hoping desperately that such measures would prove unnecessary. As the hours passed without any trace of the missing child, the atmosphere in Millbrook Falls began to change. The comfortable certainty that nothing truly bad could happen in their quiet town started to crumble. Parents who had always allowed their children to play freely began calling them inside. Business owners who had never worried about locking their doors during daylight hours found themselves reaching for keys they rarely used. Detective Ray Morrison from the County Sheriff's Department arrived in Millbrook Falls just after noon, bringing with him resources and expertise that the small town's police force lacked. A veteran of dozens of missing person cases, Morrison immediately began organizing a more systematic approach to the investigation. He established a command center at the town hall, coordinated with state police to issue an Amber Alert, and began the difficult process of questioning everyone who had been near the coffee shop that morning. The interviews revealed a frustrating pattern of ordinary interactions and unremarkable observations. Customers remembered seeing Ellie at the shop earlier that morning, cheerfully helping her grandmother as she always did. Several recalled her sweeping near the front of the store, but no one could provide any information about her actual disappearance. No one had seen her leave the building. No one had noticed anything suspicious or out of place. Tom Bradley, the hardware store employee who had purchased his morning espresso around 9:15, became particularly important to the investigation. He had been one of the last customers to interact with Ellie before her disappearance, and Morrison questioned him extensively about every detail of his visit to the coffee shop. Bradley remembered Ellie's bright smile as she helped her grandmother prepare his order. He recalled her mentioning that she was looking forward to Halloween, still 2 weeks away, and her excitement about the costume she was planning. But he had left the shop before 9:30, and his description of Ellie's demeanor revealed nothing unusual or concerning. The physical evidence from the coffee shop itself proved equally unhelpful. The abandoned broom had been handled by too many people before the police arrived to yield useful fingerprints. The building's floors and surfaces showed the typical traces of dozens of daily customers, creating a forensic nightmare of overlapping traces that revealed nothing specific about Ellie's fate. The front door, which Margaret insisted had never chimed to indicate someone entering or leaving, provided no clues about how a child could have exited the building without being noticed. As evening approached on that first day, the search efforts expanded beyond the immediate downtown area. Volunteers organized into teams that systematically covered every street, every vacant lot, every wooded area within a 2-mile radius of the coffee shop. They called Ellie's name continuously, their voices echoing through the quiet neighborhoods and becoming increasingly desperate as darkness fell without any response. The Price family spent that first night in a state of suspended horror, unable to sleep or eat, while hundreds of their neighbors continued the search under portable floodlights and flashlights. Sarah Price sat motionless in Ellie's bedroom, surrounded by the artifacts of childhood that suddenly seemed both precious and heartbreaking. The half-finished art project on the small desk, the stuffed animals arranged carefully on the bed, the school clothes laid out for Monday morning, all bore witness to a life interrupted in the most inexplicable way. David Price joined the search teams, unable to remain idle, while his daughter remained missing. He walked through the night with groups of volunteers, his voice growing hoarse from calling Ellie's name, his flashlight beams sweeping across every shadow and crevice they encountered. The rational part of his mind understood that 8-year-old children did not simply vanish without explanation, but the alternative possibilities were too terrible to contemplate directly. Margaret Price remained at the coffee shop long after the police had finished their initial examination of the scene. She sat in the same chair where she'd been working when Ellie disappeared, replaying those final moments over and over, searching for some detail she might have missed, some clue that could explain the impossible. The image of her granddaughter, humming while she swept, looking out at the autumn trees with innocent pleasure, became frozen in her memory like a photograph that she would carry for the rest of her life. The second day brought expanded resources and growing media attention. Television news crews from the regional network arrived to document the search efforts, their cameras capturing the organized chaos of volunteers combing through the countryside surrounding Millbrook Falls. The story of the vanished coffee shop helper resonated with viewers across the state, and tips began flowing into the police department from people claiming to have seen Ellie in various locations, most of them hundreds of miles away. Detective Morrison worked methodically through each reported sighting, dispatching officers to investigate even the most unlikely claims. A convenience store clerk in Pittsburgh thought she recognized Ellie from the photographs being circulated. A trucker called from Ohio, claiming to have seen a child matching her description at a rest stop. A family camping in West Virginia reported spotting a lost-looking girl near their campsite. Each lead demanded investigation, and each investigation led nowhere, consuming precious time and resources while providing no answers. The FBI's child abduction rapid deployment team arrived on the third day, bringing sophisticated investigative techniques and experience with cases that local law enforcement rarely encountered. Special Agent Lisa Chen, a specialist in stranger abduction cases, immediately expanded the scope of the investigation beyond Millbrook Falls itself. Her team began examining similar disappearances throughout the region, looking for patterns that might suggest a serial predator operating in rural communities. The statistical reality that Agent Chen brought to the investigation was both sobering and terrifying. Children who disappeared without witnesses, without evidence of struggle, and without clear motive rarely returned home alive. The first 72 hours were critical, and those hours were already passing. If Ellie had been taken by a stranger with harmful intentions, every minute of delay reduced the chances of a successful recovery. The town of Millbrook Falls began to transform under the pressure of the investigation and media attention. Streets that had been quiet and peaceful became filled with law enforcement vehicles, news vans, and the cars of volunteers arriving from neighboring communities. The coffee shop, once the heart of local social life, remained closed while police continued their examination of the scene. Yellow crime scene tape across the familiar entrance created a visual reminder that normal life had been shattered. Local businesses found themselves caught between the desire to help and the disruption to their daily operations. The hardware store, where Tom Bradley worked, became an unofficial headquarters for volunteer search teams, providing flashlights, batteries, and other supplies. The church at the end of Main Street opened its doors to serve meals for searchers, and provide space for the families of volunteers to wait and pray. As the first week passed without any trace of Ellie, the investigation began to shift focus toward the possibility that someone local was involved in her disappearance. The idea was almost unthinkable for residents who had chosen Millbrook Falls specifically because of its small-town safety and sense of community. But Agent Chen's experience had taught her that child predators often operated within familiar environments, using trust and routine access to identify and approach their victims. The process of investigating long-time residents and community members proved emotionally devastating for everyone involved. Teachers from Ellie's school found themselves answering detailed questions about their interactions with students. Coaches and volunteers from youth organizations were asked to account for their whereabouts on the morning of October 15th. Even family, friends, and regular customers of the coffee shop became subjects of scrutiny, their normal behaviors suddenly viewed through the lens of potential suspicious activity. Margaret Price struggled with the implications of this expanded investigation. The idea that someone she knew, someone who had smiled at Ellie and perhaps even complimented her helpfulness at the coffee shop, might have harmed her granddaughter, challenged every assumption she had made about human nature and community safety. She found herself studying the faces of people she had known for years, wondering if evil could hide behind such familiar features. The investigation revealed several individuals whose backgrounds warranted closer examination. A maintenance worker at the elementary school had been arrested for minor theft several years earlier. A substitute teacher had moved to Millbrook Falls from another state, under circumstances that were not entirely clear. A recently divorced man who lived alone near the downtown area had been the subject of noise complaints from neighbors concerned about his behavior. Each of these potential suspects underwent extensive investigation. Police examined their alibis. For October 15th, searched their homes and vehicles, interviewed their employers and acquaintances. The maintenance worker had been at the school that morning, with multiple witnesses to confirm his presence. The substitute teacher had been substitute teaching at a school in the next county, with classroom documentation to verify her location. The divorced man had been at work at the paper mill, clocking in and out with electronic records that provided an unshakable alibi. The lack of viable suspects created a sense of frustrated desperation among the investigators and the community. If Ellie had been taken by a stranger passing through town, the chances of identifying and apprehending that person decreased with each passing day. If someone local was responsible, they had managed to cover their tracks with remarkable thoroughness, leaving no evidence of their involvement. 2 weeks after Ellie's disappearance, the active search efforts began to wind down. Hundreds of volunteers had covered every accessible area within a 20-mile radius of Millbrook Falls. Professional search and rescue teams had used trained dogs to examine locations where a body might have been concealed. The river had been dragged multiple times, and divers had explored every deep pool and underwater obstruction that might have trapped a small victim. The Price family faced the terrible transition from active crisis to grinding uncertainty. The initial flood of support from the community continued, but the intensity of the first weeks could not be sustained indefinitely. People returned to their normal routines while carrying the weight of an unresolved tragedy. Children went back to school under increased supervision. Parents developed new rules about where their kids could go and when they could be alone. Sarah Price took extended leave from her job at the paper mill, unable to concentrate on normal responsibilities while her daughter remained missing. She spent her days making phone calls to law enforcement agencies, following up on reported sightings and maintaining the networks of volunteers who continued searching in smaller groups. The house that had once been filled with Ellie's laughter became a command center for an investigation that seemed to have no end. David Price returned to work after 3 weeks, but found that his ability to focus on mechanical repairs and machinery maintenance had been severely compromised. His co-workers at the paper mill treated him with careful kindness, avoiding direct questions about the investigation while offering practical support. The routine of his job provided some structure to days that otherwise felt shapeless and endless. Margaret Price eventually reopened the coffee shop, driven partly by financial necessity and partly by the hope that maintaining normal operations might somehow attract information about Ellie's fate. The first morning back was emotionally devastating. Regular customers approached the counter with tears in their eyes, offering support while struggling to find appropriate words. The small broom that Ellie had been using remained in the storage room, too painful to display, but too precious to discard. As autumn turned to winter and winter gave way to spring, the investigation into Ellie's disappearance entered a different phase. Active leads had been exhausted, physical searches had been completed, and the FBI team had returned to other cases. Detective Morrison continued to work the case, but with reduced resources and diminishing hope for a breakthrough. The missing person file remained open, but the daily urgency of the initial investigation had necessarily given way to the patient work of reviewing evidence and waiting for new information. The first anniversary of Ellie's disappearance brought renewed media attention and a fresh wave of tips from the public. None of these new leads proved more substantive than those from the first weeks of the investigation. A billboard featuring Ellie's photograph was erected on the main highway leading into Millbrook Falls, paid for by donations from community members who refused to let her memory fade. The image of her gap-toothed smile became a symbol of loss and hope for people who had never met her. The Price family established a foundation dedicated to missing children, channeling their grief into advocacy work that might help other families facing similar tragedies. They traveled to conferences, met with lawmakers, and supported legislative changes designed to improve the response to child abduction cases. The work provided some sense of purpose, but it could never fill the void left by Ellie's absence. As years passed, the case began to take on the characteristics of a cold file. New detectives inherited the investigation as retirements and transfers changed the personnel involved. Each new investigator reviewed the evidence with fresh eyes, hoping to identify some overlooked detail that might provide a breakthrough. They re-interviewed witnesses, re-examined physical evidence with improved forensic techniques, and explored new theories about what might have happened. The town of Millbrook Falls gradually healed from the acute trauma of those first weeks, but the scar remained visible in small ways. Parents continued to watch their children more closely. The coffee shop prospered under Margaret's determined management, but visitors could still see Ellie's photograph on the wall behind the counter, surrounded by yellow ribbons and handwritten messages of hope. Halloween became a somber time, marked by the memory of the costume Ellie had been planning but never got to wear. Detective Morrison, who had requested assignment to other cases after the first year, found that he could not forget the coffee shop girl who had vanished without explanation. Even while working on new investigations, he would occasionally return to Ellie's file, reviewing the evidence and considering new possibilities. The case had become personal for him in a way that professional training warned against, but that human nature made inevitable. The construction boom that hit Millbrook Falls in the early 2000s brought changes to the downtown area where Ellie had disappeared. New businesses opened, older buildings were renovated, and the character of Main Street evolved with the changing times. The coffee shop remained, anchored by Margaret's determination to maintain the business that had become a memorial to her granddaughter, but the surrounding environment shifted as economic growth brought new residents and different energy to the community. Among the properties affected by the changing downtown landscape was a narrow 3-story house located on Oak Street, just 3 blocks from Millbrook Coffee Company. Built in the 1920s as a single-family residence, the structure had been converted to apartments sometime in the 1960s and had housed a succession of tenants over the decades. By 2010, the building had fallen into serious disrepair, with structural problems that made it unsuitable for occupancy. The property had been owned since 1987 by Harold Cunningham, a man in his 70s who had worked for 30 years as a bookkeeper for various local businesses before retiring. Cunningham lived alone in the top-floor apartment while renting out the other units. But declining health and the building's deteriorating condition had forced him to stop accepting tenants by 2008. He moved to a nursing home in 2011, and the building stood vacant, slowly deteriorating as weather and time took their toll on the aging structure. The city of Millbrook Falls condemned the building in early 2012, citing safety violations and structural deficiencies that posed risks to public health and safety. Property records showed that Cunningham had fallen behind on taxes and maintenance, and the building had become an eyesore in a downtown area that civic leaders were working to revitalize. The decision was made to demolish the structure and return the lot to productive use. In June 2012, contractors from Riverside Demolition began the process of preparing the building for destruction. Their work required a thorough inspection of the structure to identify potential hazards, particularly asbestos insulation and lead paint that might require special handling during demolition. The inspection team included owner Jake Riverside, who had been demolishing old buildings throughout the region for more than 20 years, and his son Michael, who was learning the family business. The building's layout was typical of structures from its era, with a basement that had been subdivided into storage areas and utility spaces. Most of the basement was accessible through a wooden staircase that descended from the first floor, but the inspection revealed some irregularities in the floor plan that suggested modifications had been made over the years. In particular, there appeared to be a section of the basement that was sealed off from the main area, hidden behind what looked like a newer wall constructed sometime after the original building. Jake Riverside had encountered similar situations in other old buildings, where previous owners had walled off sections of basements to create additional storage or to seal away areas with water damage or structural problems. The standard procedure was to examine these sealed areas to ensure they contain no hazardous materials that might complicate the demolition process. On the afternoon of June 18, 2012, he and his son began the work of opening the sealed section. To complete their inspection, the wall that blocked access to the hidden basement area had been constructed with relatively modern materials, suggesting it had been built sometime in the 1980s or early 1990s. The work was professional, but not elaborate, the kind of project that a moderately skilled homeowner might have undertaken to convert unused space for storage purposes. Breaking through the drywall and framing took most of the afternoon, with father and son working methodically to avoid damaging whatever lay beyond. When they finally opened a gap large enough to shine flashlights into the sealed area, both men initially saw what appeared to be a small storage room, perhaps 8 feet by 10 feet, with a concrete floor and unfinished walls. Cardboard boxes were stacked along one wall, and various household items were scattered throughout the space. It looked like the kind of forgotten storage that accumulates in basement areas over decades of normal use. But as Jake Riverside directed his flashlight beam across the floor of the sealed room, moving from left to right to get a complete view of the space, the light revealed something that would forever change not only his own life, but the lives of everyone connected to Ellie Price's disappearance 18 years earlier. In the far corner of the room, lying on the concrete floor in a way that suggested it had been carefully placed rather than casually discarded, was what appeared to be a child's garment. The discovery that Jake and Michael Riverside made in that sealed basement room on June 18, 2012, would finally provide the answers that Ellie Price's family had sought for 18 agonizing years. It would force the residents of Millbrook Falls to confront the reality that evil had indeed been hiding among them, wearing a familiar face and exploiting the trust of a community that had never imagined such betrayal was possible. And it would reveal that the person responsible for Ellie's disappearance had not only known her personally, but had been present in the coffee shop, perhaps even spoken with her, on the very morning she vanished. The call that Jake Riverside made to the Millbrook Falls Police Department at 4:23 p.m. on June 18th would set in motion a chain of events that would finally bring justice for Ellie Price and closure for her family. Detective Morrison, now a lieutenant with the County Sheriff's Department but still haunted by the unsolved case, would find himself racing back to the small town where a little girl's laughter had been silenced nearly 2 decades earlier. When the investigators descended into that sealed basement room and examined the evidence that had been hidden there for 18 years, they would uncover not just the truth about what happened to Ellie Price, but a carefully concealed pattern of predatory behavior that had been operating in plain sight since before her disappearance. The revelation would be more shocking than anyone had imagined, involving someone who had been considered above suspicion, someone who had even participated in the initial search efforts, someone whose betrayal of community trust represented the worst kind of evil that could exist in a small town. The small brown apron that Jake Riverside's flashlight had illuminated in that basement corner was indeed the one that Ellie had worn so proudly on the morning she disappeared, the one with Ellie's assistant embroidered in golden thread across the front. But it was not alone in that hidden room. Beside it, connected by a length of rusted chain that spoke of imprisonment and unspeakable cruelty, lay evidence of what Ellie had endured in her final hours, evidence that would lead investigators directly to the person who had taken her from the coffee shop and held her captive in this underground prison until her young life ended in terror and isolation. The name on the property deed, Harold Cunningham, would initially focus the investigation on the elderly former bookkeeper. But a deeper examination of the evidence and the timeline would reveal that Cunningham had purchased the building from someone else, someone who had constructed the sealed basement room for a specific and horrifying purpose, someone who had used his access to the coffee shop and his knowledge of Ellie's routines to plan and execute her abduction with methodical precision. The revelation that would emerge from the basement room would explain how Ellie had been taken from the coffee shop without anyone noticing her departure. It would reveal why no witnesses had seen her leave, why the front door had never chimed, and how her abductor had been able to move through the downtown area without attracting attention. The truth would demonstrate that the person responsible had not only known the building intimately, but had prepared the basement prison months in advance, waiting for the right opportunity to strike. Margaret Price received the phone call from Detective Morrison at 5:15 p.m. on June 18, 2012. She was preparing to close the coffee shop for the day, going through the same routine she had followed for nearly 20 years, when her phone rang with the news that would finally answer the questions that had tormented her family since that terrible October morning. Her granddaughter had been found. The person responsible had been identified. Justice, delayed for 18 years, was finally within reach. The arrest took place at 6:30 p.m. on June 18, 2012. The suspect, who had lived quietly in Millbrook Falls for decades after Ellie's disappearance, had never been seriously considered as a potential perpetrator. His alibi for the morning of October 15, 1994, had been accepted without question because it had been provided by family members who had no reason to lie. His participation in the search efforts had been seen as evidence of community spirit, rather than the calculated deception it actually represented. But the evidence found in the sealed basement room told a different story, one of careful planning and cruel execution. Personal items that belonged to Ellie, items that her family had assumed were lost forever, had been kept as trophies. A journal, written in the perpetrator's own handwriting, documented not only the crime against Ellie, but plans for other potential victims, plans that had been abandoned only because the investigation had made him too cautious to continue. The confession came 2 days later, after the weight of physical evidence made denial impossible. The details were more horrifying than anyone had imagined, revealing that Ellie had been kept alive in the basement room for several days before her death, that she had called out for her family, that she had begged to be allowed to go home. The person who had taken her life was someone she had trusted, someone who had smiled at her across the counter of the coffee shop, someone who had used that trust to lure her away from safety. The trial, when it finally took place, would provide complete closure for the Price family and the community of Millbrook Falls. The defendant, faced with overwhelming evidence and his own confession, pleaded guilty to murder and kidnapping charges. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never again have the opportunity to harm another child. For Margaret Price, who had kept the coffee shop operating for 18 years while carrying the burden of not knowing what had happened to her beloved granddaughter, the resolution brought both relief and overwhelming grief. The questions that had haunted her for nearly 2 decades had finally been answered, but the answers confirmed her worst fears about Ellie's suffering. She could finally grieve properly, knowing that her granddaughter's killer would never walk free, but the knowledge of what Ellie had endured made that grief almost unbearable. The sealed basement room was thoroughly documented by investigators before the building was demolished as originally planned. The structure that had hidden such terrible secrets was finally destroyed, and the lot was converted into a small memorial park dedicated to Ellie's memory. A bench was installed where visitors could sit quietly and remember a little girl whose life had been cut short by unconscionable evil, but whose memory had inspired positive changes in child safety protocols throughout the region. The case of Ellie Price became a study in how predators can hide in plain sight, using community trust and carefully constructed personas to conceal their true nature. The investigation revealed that the perpetrator had been planning similar crimes for years, identifying potential victims and learning their routines, but had been deterred by the intensive law enforcement response to Ellie's disappearance. In a sense, her death had prevented other tragedies, though such knowledge provided little comfort to those who loved her. Today, nearly 30 years after that terrible October morning, the Millbrook Coffee Company still operates on Main Street, still serving the community that rallied together in the face of unthinkable tragedy. Margaret Price, now in her 80s, continues to work there part-time, surrounded by photographs and memories of the granddaughter who had brightened the shop. With her presence for such a brief time, Ellie's small brown apron, returned to the family after the trial, hangs framed behind the counter, a reminder of innocence lost but justice finally served. The story of Ellie Price serves as a somber reminder that evil can exist anywhere, that the people we trust most may not deserve that trust, and that the most ordinary places can hide the most extraordinary horrors. But it also demonstrates the power of a community's love, the persistence of those who refuse to give up on finding truth, and the importance of never forgetting the victims of such senseless crimes. In the end, Ellie's memory became a force for protecting other children, ensuring that her brief life had meaning that extended far beyond the tragedy of her death.